Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Arash Azizi, a Ph.D. candidate at New York University, to talk about the history of communist internationalism in Iraq and Iran. Arash, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you just get us started out with telling us what is the main argument of what you're studying, and maybe give us a little context, historical context around what it is that you're studying. And then if you could attach this to a couple of other smaller questions of, you talk about this thing called the Tudeh Party of Iran and the Iraqi Communist Party. What are these parties and what are they aiming at within the context of your research?
My dissertation is about communist internationalism, particularly communist internationalism in the Middle East in the post-war period. So, 1940s, 50s, 60s, I sort of come up to the 1970s and the Iranian Revolution at the end of that decade. Now, communist internationalism was a particular mode of politics that interested me because, at the first glance, it might seem sort of mundane or it might be very obvious what it is, but it's not quite the case, because communist internationalism did a couple of things together that are basically, I can say with some confidence, entirely absent on the left today, or very rare on the left today. They're sort of a forgotten tradition. They did two things that seem to be even in contradiction sometimes, but actually went hand in hand. First of all, they believed in internationalism, i.e., they believed in international collaboration. They believed in international activity. They believed that the interest of the world working class, is shared, and that they tried to, what communist parties, which are mass forces in almost every country in the world, all over the world, we had very large communist parties. They put the interests of their international partners and they put the interest of the international working class first in what they did. But the second thing that went in tandem with this was that they actually took the national framework very seriously, i.e., they were very good patriots, basically, and they distinguished what they called sort of socialist patriotism from a more right-wing nationalism. These two things were sort of an amazing combination of being internationalists, but also people who took the national framework very seriously and they were indeed good patriots. And in my dissertation, I look at the two parties you named, the Tudeh Party of Iran, which is the Communist Party of Iran, and the Iraqi Communist Party. And other parties in the Middle East I look at, but these are the main two actors. And I'm interested in them because they, in a period in which there were many fights and wars and sectarian divisions and national hatreds and ethnic oppositions, these two parties managed to keep an alliance together that went on even when the two countries started a bloody war in the 1980s.
So you talk about communist internationalism against the backdrop of the war that was going on between Iraq and Iran in the 1980s. And you note that despite the fact that these two countries were in combat with each other, the communist parties of these two respective countries stood in solidarity with one another. And I want to couple that with another piece here, which is that you mentioned that as the Soviet Union got caught up in the Cold War, these two communist parties, the Tudeh Party of Iran and the Iraqi Communist Party, became important pillars for communism in the Middle East. So can you talk a little bit about, in addition to supporting peace, what were these two parties' larger goals?
I mean, the parties fought for socialism. That was their big, grand goal, of course. As communist parties, they fought for socialism. And I want to, again, remind the audience that these are not, these parties were not sort of three men and the dog, as a lot of sort of left organizations are. These were mass influential parties. The Tudeh Party of Iran, before its banning in 1953, had, following a US-supported coup in Iran, before that, it had tens of thousands of members. It controlled mass trade unions. It had, at some point, it entered the government. It had 4 cabinet ministries. It had many members of the parliament. It was a very influential force. Almost every intellectual in Iran supported it at that point. The Iraqi Communist Party had similarly a very large following in Iraq across all the main 3 communities, like Kurdish and Arab Shia and Arab Sunni. And following the 1958 revolution in Iraq, the Iraqi Communist Party also had an important role in the army. It basically supported the revolutionary government of Abdul Karim Qasim. But so as for their goals, it's interesting because it ties down to my previous point. Because yes, obviously their role was socialism, communism. They were communists. They wanted the world without classes. But again, in contradistinction to much of today's left, the question was, how do you get there, right? How do you get there to socialism? Do you just shout socialism at every occasion, and then don't support any non-socialists? I mentioned, for example, that the Iranian communists entered the government, but this was a government of Qavam, the prime minister, who was furthest thing from a socialist. He was a massive landowner and sort of a Machiavelli of Iranian politics for many years. But of course, they entered it because they had a strategic goal. Now, this is because, as I said, they have strategic conceptions of power and how they can get to socialism. And a important project, as it comes to that internationalism I talked about, an important project for them was building of a strong nation states. In fact, this was seen as an anti-colonial move, right? This was, both Iran had been never a formal colony, but had been dominated by Britain and Russia. And, in general, it had been in sort of a semi-colonial position in some ways. And Iraq had been a mandate, had been a British mandate following the First World War. It was run by Britain in a colonial fashion. It gained independence in the 1930s, but there was sort of increasing fights to assert its independence. So these communist internationalists, their first goal in a way was not nationalism, but asserting national sovereignty. So they were very interested in a sovereign Iraq, sovereign independent national Iraq, and in a sovereign independent national Iran, which is why they advocate. They try to build a particular form of patriotism. That again, it's very important. Sort of, you don't see as much today. I should say that the American communists did the same. American communists went out of their way to be American patriots. They showed pictures of Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. They tried to build an American patriotism. My point is, this is what communists believed. Communists believed nations. They took nations seriously, and they took as an important concept. This wasn't just opportunistic, and they tried to show that they're the best patriots. And this was not in contradiction with their internationalism. In fact, it went hand in hand with them. They also took other positions, by the way, that might be of surprise to today's left. For example, they advocated for the rights of Palestinians. They also advocated for Israel's right to exist. Both Iranian and Iraqi communists advocated for Israel's right to exist, and in fact supported Israel's foundation. And for the first few years of Israeli existence, they even held out the hope that Israel could become a sort of a socialist state, a socialist anti-colonial state, and all that. And the slogan of the Iraqi communists advanced the slogan of Israeli Arab Brotherhood in the early 50s. And of course, they were heavily attacked by the chauvinism of their own countries. But it was a very heroic attempt to build an internationalist position that really respected everybody's right to self-determination in the region, including of the Israelis. And it shows a very, again, forgotten moral politics that I hope my dissertation can play a role in uncovering.
So again, to repeat what I'd said earlier, you talk about how the activities of communist internationalism within the context of your research is taking place against the backdrop of this war that's happening between the two countries, and they stand in solidarity with one another. But to what extent were there disagreement between these two communist parties or communist parties of other Middle Eastern nations? And how did these conflicts unfold, if there were any conflicts, and did this create ruptures between different communist parties, or were there generally speaking mechanisms to keep the peace between communist parties of different nations in the Middle East?
Yeah, there were always conflicts, and I should say there were conflicts inside the parties, and there were conflicts between the parties, and this was an important part of this dual mechanism that I talk about. Is the internationalism means that the communists saw themselves as part of a world communist movement, which of course they believed was led by the Soviet Union. So they had disagreements about the affairs of the world communist movement, you can say, and there were very important moments that led to much disagreement and of course a split. We know the biggest ones in 1956 and in 1968. Soviet Union twice invaded respectively Hungary and Czechoslovakia to put down the independent communist governments in these two countries, and this led to huge disaffection. It led to a lot of people leaving these parties, and there were disagreements within the movement as to how to respond to this. Ultimately, many parties would oppose the Soviet Union over the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and the tendency called Eurocommunism, which was led by communist parties in Italy and Spain. It was one example of this. There was the Maoist split, basically, in the world communist movement. There was a disagreement from the late 50s onto the 60s as to whether China or the Soviet Union was the leading light, and what that meant. And inside all of these parties, you had disagreements. So I say this because these examples are better known. Middle East parties are not exception to this. Middle East communist parties, there were disagreements on the key question of Israel. There were always disagreements. For example, even back in the late 40s, in the few years after foundation of Israel in 48, where the nature of Israeli foreign policy was not clear, there were a lot of disagreements. Let's say between Iranian and Iraqi communists, many of whom were Jewish, by the way, also in both parties. There was a lot of disagreements as to how to treat Israel. Generally, the Iranian communists were much more positive. They supported Israel in the 1948 war. They basically believed in general that Israel was a potentially progressive force in the region, even though they rejected the premiership of Ben Gurion, and they sort of disagreed with the main Zionist parties there. But they believed they worked both with Palestinian communists, which were citizens of Israel, and with Mapam, which was a major Zionist party. So the Iranian communists had a much more positive view toward Israel, whereas the Iraqis from the beginning were more apprehensive, and there were some debates between the two parties. Incidentally, this is interesting because usually the story that we hear is that the Soviet Union enforced a position on everybody, and that's why they supported the partition of Palestine. That's why they supported the declaration of Israel, foundation of Israel. The question is, if Soviet Union could dictate it, why were the Iranian Iraqis engaging in this heavy debate? So it clearly shows that it wasn't a basic issue of dictation. While of course Soviet Union, what Soviet Union said mattered a lot, and sometimes they could enforce it in some ways. There was still a lot of debate. So on the question of Israel, onto the 50s and 60s and 70s, there will always be debates as to what should be the posture of the communist movement toward the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, toward the guerrilla fight, and the guerrilla fights against Israel, and there were disagreements. The Communist Party of Syria, for example, led by Khalid Baktash, perhaps the most well-known Arab communist of his era, who had been in the Comintern back in the 30s that met Mao Zedong. It was sort of it was the first Arab communist elected to parliament when it was elected to parliament in Syria. Allegedly, I think they might have fixed someone before him. But anyways, he had, let's say, a much more anti-Israel line, and there were a lot of disagreements and debates. So there was always disagreement and debate inside the communist movement. But the fascinating point is that the modus operandi of these debates and the mode of politics that the communists had was in that same internationalist vein. They believed the interests of the world working class mattered, and they believed the national sovereignty of these states mattered. And that's how they conducted their politics, and that made them unique. And both in contradiction to the other parties then, and in contradiction to most of left politics today.
I guess now thinking in more broad scope and philosophical terms, when we talk about communism and communist internationalism in the Middle East, what uh, discourse did they add to the discussion of communism that was different from the sort of conventional understanding of communism that we have that's coming largely out of the Soviet Union and China? So, in other words, in what way did their understanding of communism contrast with the two sort of big players of communism during the Cold War?
I think the question we should ask ourselves is why was there such mass support for communism around the world, right? How is it that, and you can have this example almost anywhere in the world, right? How is it that young men and women in Kansas, dock workers in San Francisco, mining workers in Britain, come to become communists and support the Communist Party and this world movement that was led by the Soviet Union? It's the same question in the Middle East, right? Ordinary men and women in their thousands, and leading intellectuals and workers, women, religious minorities, this all joined the communist movement. It wasn't so much that it was different from what's in the Soviet Union and China. Well, it's different everywhere, right? Every country has its own different conditions, but for them, communism answered the questions of their own society. And this is a fascinating mode of, again, internationalist politics. What do I mean by this, right? It's one thing to say, okay, we have some problems here, so I'll join a liberal party because I want a more liberal solution or a conservative solution. But what communism allowed to do had a dual function. If you were a woman in Iran in 1940s, Communist Party did two things for you. First of all, it was the only party which promoted women's membership, which had women leaders, had a woman dedicated organization. It really allowed activity for women in a very serious way, which was absent in politics, which was supposed to be a man's game. This story is not unique to Iran. It's a story of much of the world, really. Both socialist and communist movement allowed this. But so this is the first function it had, right? So it answered a need that was particular to Iran. But it also meant that young woman who had joined the Communist Party in Iran was part of something very big and exciting, part of a world communist movement that in the Cold War was fighting over the fate of the world with the capitalist camp led by the United States. So, this was what made communism special, that communists were able to do these two things together, to both have parties that spoke to the local conditions and, from various small places to, to the nation, as I said, and were part of this world movement. Of course, there are many negative things we can say about it, right? There was a lot of nasty things that happened in the Soviet Union. The model that they offered at the end was not a very progressive socialism in their own countries, right? And we can have a disagreement about that. I don't want to just be sort of enthusiast, but what was unique about them was this, as I said, this locking in of national progressive struggles to internationalism. Look how different it is today, for example, when we discuss something like Russia and Ukraine. Whereas the way that, let's say, American socialists in the DSA, which is the main socialist organization here, discuss this, it's as if the workers of Russia and Ukraine don't exist, or they exist on another planet. I don't want to say everybody is like that, but I think the general modus operandi does not really take into account this sort of internationalist outlook. If anything, has a very weird condescension in which, you are anti-imperialist, you hate your own country's machinations in other places, but in a very one-sided way. And you don't really take into account that, okay, what is the nature of the regime in Russia itself? What is the nature of sort of class structure there? And it's like a blind spot. If you see the discussions in this, it doesn't even come into being. This was not the case in the communist movement. And the last thing I'd say in this regard is that, for example, if you look, anti-Americanism was very questioned, let's say, in the communist movement. It wasn't always absent, but it was questioned. For example, in the Soviet Union, and wherever there would be sort of very anti-communist, very xenophobic sort of statements, often leading communist thinkers like Ilya Ehrenburg would say something like, "No, America is a land of great progressive writers and fighters." While they resolutely supported the communist side in the Cold War, They would never, you know, sort of make an enemy of an entire country, because they believed that in that country there were forces that they needed to support, i.e., the American progressives, as they defined it. So yeah, that's what that's what made communist internationalism such a fascinating kaleidoscopic. If you look at it in different countries, you really learn a lot more about world politics, but also about politics of those countries in question.
Before we wrap up, we just have a couple more questions. I want to think more to today's times now. So, how is the history of communism and communist internationalism looked at and talked about today when you talk to just maybe the average person in Iraq or Iran? How is it talked about in those countries, high school history textbooks? And just sort of generally societally, how are people understanding this time period that you wrote about?
I think, unfortunately, much of the not just in Iran and Iraq, but broadly speaking, I think the reason I picked this as a dissertation topic, and the reason I want to work on it, is to work against an erasure, because I think there's an erasure of really this fascinating mode of politics they had. It's interesting how this erasure works, because some people might be, what we call tankies, as a sort of as a short term or as a slang nickname for people who are basically supportive of, let's say, authoritarianism of the Soviet Union. But even, what they usually miss is that these communist parties were far from being hardliners in a way, because they really they knew how to speak to a mass audience. So the policies that they advocated, these policies were very they're very flexible, and they're very speaking to the issues of the day. They definitely didn't believe you sit out elections unless a socialist is running, right? They didn't believe it makes no difference whether US is governed by a Democrat or a Republican. They didn't believe you boycott elections almost anywhere. They didn't, so it's fascinating that communist movement is remembered both by the so-called tanky supporters, but also by its, opponents, who just see communism as a dirty, bad thing. Back in the past, to support the Soviet Union was terrible. There was nothing good about it. It was authoritarian. What they both miss is the reality of the actually existing communist parties actually offered a mode of politics that has something for us to remember, because it was internationalist, because it was progressive, because it was the best antidote to ethnic chauvinism, to religious sectarianism, because it had a vision of the world which was by definition internationalist, and which meant that it needed to speak to various communities, right? That's why on the question of Israel, unlike much of today's left, a communist could never basically disregard the rights of millions of Israeli Jews. It couldn't just, it would just go against everything in communism, right? You can't just make an enemy of an entire national community, right? It goes against the basis of internationalism, and they paid a very high price for this, because of course it's easier to gain support in one national community by making an enemy of others. That's why the communists were not anti-Americans, as we talked about, because they believed that the American workers were a force that needed to be supported, and many other examples. So I think it's this erasure that I worked against in countries of Iran and Iraq. Yes, both of these parties exist, by the way. To the party of Iran as a very small shell in exile, which is repressed by the Islamic regime in Iran. The Iraqi Communist Party is actually now a legal entity in Iraq. It had members of parliament. In fact, it was in the winning coalition in the last election. It didn't run in the last election. It didn't run, but in the one before that, it was part of the winning coalition.
And just to clarify for people, you said it is a legal party now, not an illegal party.
Yes, exactly. It's a legal party in Iraq, and continues working. Has thousands of members. But I think in general, a lot of this erasure that I talked about exists generally. A lot of people don't have very good opinions of the left necessarily, and there has been a generational challenge. And perhaps more importantly, is the very concept of political parties has been challenged a little bit, and it's interesting to see that. And it's interesting to see the future of that, because I think we are very much in the middle of it. I think I'll just say that I think something very valuable has been lost when this tradition of political parties has been weakened. In the past, if you're a young person in the 50s and the 60s, you join a political party if you wanted to be sort of politically active. That's what you did in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. For the past few decades, this is a very uncool thing to do for many people. Even those who are politically active, they are active around hashtags. They're active around anything but durable political parties. But I think political parties are very important instruments, and I think, in fact, there is no possibility of serious progressive change, durable progressive change, without political organizations and ultimately without political parties. So I think it's not just the left and the communist parties, but in general, the traditions of organized politics that has been challenged. And I think if the left is to have any chance in Iran, Iraq, or other places, we need reactivation of this tradition. Although it might be that I am born in 1988, and it might be that this is the world of 20th century that would be buried, and something entirely different will happen in this new century. I'm skeptical of whether this is the case or not. But at any rate, we are in the middle of the story, and thankfully I became a historian, so my job is mostly to write about the past, not predict the future.
Last question before we go. If someone is listening to this podcast episode and they're interested in knowing more about this historical time period or just communist internationalism in general, can you briefly give us one or two books that you would recommend?
Well, first of all, I have to make a plug for my book. I've written a book. It's not exactly on this topic, but these questions are certainly discussed there. The book is called Shadow Commander. It's published by One World Publications, and you can get it on your independent bookstores or sort of any website. It's very easy to get. Shadow Commander, and it is the story. It's the biography of an Iranian general called Qasem Soleimani, who ran the external operations of the Iranian regime. But the story of the rise of the Iranian regime would be impossible to tell without how it needed to replace the main political force within the Shia communities, especially in Iraq, Lebanon, and partly in Iran itself, which was international communism. So that story is there. As for other book recommendations on communism, it's a broad question, to be honest. But there's a lot of fascinating work being done now in Cold War studies and in communism studies. I recommend those who are of more scholarly mind. If you look at Cold War history and Journal of Cold War Studies, these are two big academic journals. If you look at the book reviews, of the recent years, you'll see some fascinating work that is being done. And Arne Westad is a very well-known historian who's written a book about the history of Cold War, that I also recommend.
Great. Arash, thank you for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.